Well, it'd be no surprise, but the more distance we get from the COVID pandemic, the more absurd and crazy and unfathomable all those rules now seem. At the time, the medical evidence was arbitrary, I'd regard at best. But now this has also been backed up today by the former Federal Health Minister, Greg Hunt, who's gone public, making it very clear that some of it was highly political. Well, no surprises there. Joining me is someone who consistently called out the overreach, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Well, Tony, thank you for your time. I mean, it's almost like I have PTSD when I go back into those horrible couple of years coming out of Victoria, particularly coming out of Melbourne, how tough that all was. But we finally got some truth today from one of the key COVID players, the former Federal Health Minister, Greg Hunt, who's gone public, confirming that most of the big decisions, they weren't just about health advice, they were highly political. In fact, he really goes after the premiers in particular. But I suspect you're not surprised by any of this, are you?
No, Peter, and I think you put it pretty well in your editorial earlier when you said that the problem was that the policy to deal with COVID turned out to be far worse than the disease itself. And when you go back and look at this honestly and dispassionately, you'd have to say that the first mistake that governments made was throwing out the carefully prepared pandemic plans that we all had in panic in early March 2020 because of the dire photographs coming out of overwhelmed Italian hospitals. But I think that had a lot more to do with the Italian hospital system than it did with the severity of the disease itself.
We've still got all the COVID debt. In Victoria, we're still paying COVID levies. In fact, we're paying COVID levies $5.5 billion worth until 2027. We've got firefighters and nurses and police still stood down over vaccine mandates because they won't have AstraZeneca in particular, and AstraZeneca has now been withdrawn from the market. I mean, this is still crazy that we're talking about this now in mid-2024.
Mm. Exactly right, Peter. And my fear is that without a fair income Royal Commission type inquiry into the whole response to COVID, next time a pandemic happens, and it will, we'll take the over-the-top response to this one as the model for all future actions. But the last thing we want to be is locked up for several years, again, in response to a disease that turned out to be relatively mild.
That's because none of the politicians, Tony Abbott, want us to know what they were told and what they decided in the papers that they read behind closed doors. That is what this is about. It's not about the next pandemic so that we are as best prepared as we can be. This is about basic backside covering from politicians like Daniel Andrews and Anastasia Palaszczuk. And I have to say, frankly, too, Scott Morrison, Josh Frydenberg and the others.
Look, I'm confident that inside the coalition, a lot of these issues would have been more debated than they seemed on the surface. But there's no doubt that for a period of time, we ceased being a democracy and became a kind of a doctocracy. Now, I'm all in favour of taking expert advice seriously, but in the end, we've got to remain an open, transparent, accountable democracy, and I'm afraid we weren't for a couple of years during the pandemic.
When we lost those Australians in MH17, you picked up the phone and you know, I was there and I saw how dogged you were with Vladimir Putin. Now, we haven't lost an Australian military life, I say yet. This has now been 3 incidents involving the Chinese, 3 very dangerous incidents. I hope we don't lose an Australian military life, but that could be more, you know, good luck rather than good management today. We find out, though, that the Prime Minister has not rung his counterpart. The Minister hasn't spoken to the Minister for Defence. The Foreign Minister hasn't spoken to the Foreign Minister. It's all been done right down the batting order by bureaucrats to register Australia's disgust at what's happened yet again. What would you do differently?
Well, the problem here, Peter, is that this isn't the first time it's happened. This is now the 3rd time that Australian military personnel have been endangered by the actions of Chinese ships and planes, and we have undoubtedly been acting within our perfect rights in international waters and in international airspace. So these are not the actions of a friend, and what puzzles me is why the government is so keen to roll out the red carpet for the Chinese Premier next month, given that this is how China is currently treating us.
I know you've just come back from Europe. You and I have spoken, and we talked particularly about those UK elections over the weekend and this real division now with these pro-Palestinian, pro-Gaza, pro-Hamas candidates getting up at local council level. It's a bad portent for us here in Australia as well. And obviously that concern that Europe really has about Russia being on the march. They seem more alive to the threats of these times. You know, the sense that it is like the end of the 1930s and we are perhaps here in Australia. Is that a fair comment?
Look, I think it is, Peter. I think that what so many of the democracies engaged in after the fall of the Berlin Wall and this assumption that market capitalism had triumphed in all places for all times, we engaged in a kind of a military, industrial and even cultural disarmament. And what we need to do now is to recover our military and our industrial strength, but above all else, our cultural self-confidence as free, independent, Western democracies with a strong Judeo-Christian tradition.
If you were still PM, Tony Abbott, would you have 3 flags behind you or one when you talk about, you know, national identity?
Look, I'm more than happy with the one flag that unites all of us. I certainly don't think that the flag of some of us should fly co-equally with the flag of all of us, just as I don't think that we need to be welcome to our own country at every civic occasion. One of the other things that would be different, we wouldn't have these pro-Hamas tent encampments on our campuses. I just think there's been a failure of will and a failure of self-confidence by too many people who should know better.
Good on you, Tony Abbott. I think many of us wish you were still there. Thank you for your time.